Hello and welcome. This is a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld.org. We continue our podcast about the war which Russia started against Ukraine. The series is brought to you by Internews Ukraine and Ukraine Crisis Media Center, two Ukrainian media NGOs. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. We are making this podcast with Tetyana Ogarkova, who is in charge of international outreach at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Hello, Tanya.
Hello.
Before we start, let me remind you that you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. So today we are going to talk about Bucha. We visited Bucha on Friday, a few days ago. Also the towns near Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel. We want to share with you some of our impressions. We also talked to several people and have some stories to share. But also, of course, we will talk about what's happening on the front line and what's happening around this war. And traditionally, we will also cover some of the topics of Russian propaganda and disinformation because it is changing. It basically shows us new narratives to which we have to be prepared because they are targeting primarily Russian population, but also the population of Global South, it seems to me. This is one of my hypotheses. So let's talk about Bucha. Irpin, Hostomel, what are your impressions?
Yes, indeed. We visited Bucha, Irpin, and Hostomel 1 month after the liberation, after the departure of Russians. So we cannot really testimony of what was really happening there. So 1 month ago. And clearly enough, the cities are now they look differently from that pictures we've seen in the media. Specifically these images with dead bodies and with all this destruction in the beginning. All the situation, it looks much better now, but at the same time we see how much really these small towns suffered from Russian army. When we were entering this direction, the first thing you see after you leave Kyiv is this famous Bucha bridge. There are two bridges, and you've definitely seen them in the photos in international media. Bucha bridge and Irpin bridge. Irpin bridge is even much more damaged. And we remember these pictures of people who are under this bridge, completely destroyed, and people try to leave the area by walking. We do remember that. When you enter in Bucha by this bridge, you see kind of destroyed bridge, but you can still pass by in the car. And the first thing you see quite a lot of buildings which are destroyed by all kind of shells. Some buildings are all right, but a lot of them are destroyed. And you also see supermarket, for example, this famous Novus supermarket. We've seen it in previous images during the occupation, which was it was not shelled, but it was attacked. I mean, local people, they took everywhere from this supermarket because there were no other possibility to get food. Then what you see when you are impressed because Bucha, when you say the word Bucha to anyone, everybody imagines that it looks like a total ruin and everywhere you have dead bodies. But in reality, it looks quite differently. So there are entire buildings and entire streets which are almost not touched by this shelling. But at the same time, it's difficult to estimate, but my impression, I might be mistaken, but I think about 20% of Bucha's buildings are destroyed or touched by shelling, and another 80% is so more or less
maybe even less than 20%.
It's difficult to, but we drove a lot through Bucha several times, making a kind of circles. Bucha is not big. Let us explain that this is a kind of a city of 50,000 people. So it's a small town, in fact. And when you travel, you just cross the street and everything is all right, as if it was before the war. And then out of the blue, you see a completely destroyed building which was in fire, for example, or a part of this building is damaged. So it looks like, and his explanation is that there were no real combats in Bucha. Bucha was occupied quite quickly. And there were no Ukrainian army. I would say there was a territorial defense in Bucha, as people reported, but it was not a kind of professional defense because everything happened very quickly in the first days of war, and they were unable to resist to these tanks, to this Russian army arriving. So Russian army.
Let's explain a bit of geography,
Yeah.
right? Because we have Hostomel, Bucha, and Irpin. Hostomel more to the north, Irpin more to the south, and Bucha in between. So as I imagine that in Hostomel there is this Hostomel Antonov airport to which Russians try to make landing by the forces and capture the airport. I don't know if they succeeded. Partially they succeeded.
Yeah, partially they were destroyed. The first groups were destroyed, but then they repeated many times, and some of them survived. And there were street fights for many days in Hostomel.
And of course, the tanks came down from the north, from Belarus. So, okay, we are repeating this story that Belarus is a part of the conflict, is a part of the war, because there would be no attack on Kyiv if Lukashenko's doesn't give a permission, or I don't know whether he was giving any permission. Belarus was also occupied by Russian army with assent of Lukashenko, and therefore the Russian forces could go down from the north.
Yeah, and on the ground, yes, indeed, Hostomel, then Bucha, then Irpin, but there is no space, almost no space between them. So it looks like, if you, for example, travel, as we traveled from Bucha to Hostomel, it takes you 10 minutes from center of the city in Bucha to center in Hostomel. 10 minutes driving. So this is extremely close, And then if you travel from Bucha to Irpin, we took this road on our way back. It looked like you quit Bucha and you arrive directly to Irpin. So it's like one agglomeration, one urban area, in fact. So it's quite close. And what were people also reporting, when attacks started in Hostomel, and in Hostomel it was key location for Russians because they wanted to
control the airport.
To control the airport, and then to land soldiers, tanks, and then to capture Kyiv. So very quickly.
Just to remind to our listeners that in 2014, some Ukrainian military experts, 15, they were sharing with us plans of Russian attack, like full-scale invasion. And they were also, I remember, mentioning Hostomel Airport as a key strategic place. So I think that basically these plans of capturing Kyiv through Hostomel Airport, they were quite old in Russia. And
maybe.
they just, this time we were actually looking at these plans with certain skepticism, but now it seems that they really try to realize
what is it? And I remember that we were paying attention to Borispol in the first hours of invasion. We were thinking about Borispol. Maybe they will be landing in Borispol, because we know Borispol is the biggest airport in Kyiv, close to Kyiv, and nobody knew about Hostomel. And even when we talked to people who still live in Bucha, few of them knew about what Hostomel Airport is and what kind of airport is this, and and they didn't realize the real danger of living close to such an airport.
Let's try to compare these two towns. Our impression is that there are more destruction in Irpin and Hostomel, less destruction in terms of buildings in Bucha, but on the contrary, there are much more deaths in Bucha than in Irpin and Hostomel. Why there is a destruction in Irpin and Hostomel? Well, because the major fights were for these cities, because Ukrainians were, trying to liberate Irpin, and from Bucha there was shelling on Irpin, for example. And Hostomel, we already explained this. Why?
And in terms of people, we know the official statistics now said that in all the Kyiv Oblast, in Kyiv region, we have 1,100 civilians who are dead during the first two months already. But among these 1,100, 412 are in Bucha. So it makes like 30% of everybody died in all the Kyiv region. We should mention also Borodyanka, who is to the north, and then many other villages from Belarusian border up to Kyiv. So it's a huge area, in fact.
So
And
huge area because we have this area, Bucha, Hostomel, Irpin, Borodyanka, others. We have the area around Zhytomyr highway to the north. So the major highway which leads from the west to Kyiv, and there were fights again in Makariv and some
Makariv as well.
other villages. We will try to visit them soon. And there was our region, which is closer to where we live, closer to Brovary, Borispil. They were coming from Chernihiv, from Sumy, and there are of course also cases
and
there.
among all victims, 400 comes solely from Bucha. So it means that really human cost in Bucha is really, and it's confirmed by figures, by numbers, is higher than in any other place in close to Kyiv.
Let's try to explain why. Because basically, these northern western suburbs are the closest to the border, to the Belarusian border. Because if we take our part, like the east, near Brovary, Borispil, etc., well, it's quite a long way from a Russian border near Sumy or from Belarusian border near Chernihiv. This is quite a long way. Hundreds, I think it's how much? It's probably 300, 400 kilometers,
It's
right,
quite
from
long.
the Russian border. And of course, there are problems with logistics, etc. So they could send much more troops to this northern western border, and plus, if they succeeded in sending troops through the air landing operation in Hostomel airport, so that they could send more. So what does it mean that Bucha has more victims, casualties, civilian casualties? Is that because it was really occupied during 1 month, the month of March, and during this occupation, many things were happening, including the tortures, including the indiscriminate shooting of people, including of signs of genocide, etc.
And rapes as well.
And rapes.
Mm-hmm.
Let's
And
try to.
let's also explain that what was reported to us by our friends who were in Bucha in the first day of aggression is that they understood directly and immediately that the war is happening, because even so it started by they saw airplanes, fight jets, missiles, and all these kind of war sounds were so much present that population in Bucha, people started living directly in the morning, most of them, and most of people thought that they will be impossible for them to stay here, and they were able to see with their proper eyes what was happening in Gostomel, because as we said, Gostomel is quite close, and it wasn't like we in Brovary, for example, and even in Kyiv, I mean on the left bank of Kyiv, we've heard several sounds and several missiles, but we are unaware of what the real danger was. For us, it would take time, etc. But Bucha people, as we said, there were 50,000 people in Bucha, and on the first day, most of them left. And in the first week, at least what people say, under occupation, there were maybe just a couple of thousand people left in Bucha, 3, maybe 5. It's impossible to say exactly, but most of people, they were so afraid that they left the city directly.
So one of the places we went was the church of Saint Andrew and All the Saints near Bucha. It also apparently near
inside Bucha. It's
inside Bucha, and it's near also the place where our colleague lives, Andrei Kulakov from Internews Ukraine, who also told us some of the stories. He was not the witness of the stories, but he also talked to these people. But symbolically, this church is also Andrew Church, like our friend, and the priest in this church is also Andrew. So it's Otec Andriy, So we talked also a little bit with him, who was during the occupation. And the thing is that there was this common cemetery near the church where common grave, yeah, no real cemetery, because the cemetery was blocked. Russians were, cutting the access to the cemetery, and there was this common grave, and around 100 bodies in general was brought to this common grave. Then now they have been how to say it, excavated, uh, ex, exhumated, right? And now those bodies who are identified, they have been buried normally in the coffins in this with the ceremony in this cemetery, and some other bodies are still in morgues, waiting for
in
identification.
Bucha and also in other places.
In Bucha and other
As we
places.
imagine, I might be mistaken, but I imagine that it were Russians who dug this big, I don't know, this big grave, and they were putting dead bodies progressively. What do you know? What do you know about it?
I'm not sure it's Russians. I think Russians just permitted it because they understood that there are many dead bodies, so they permitted this kind of a common grave. And there are many locals, also local
Maybe,
people
yeah.
from Bucha, and men who were digging this big hole. Yes.
And people were transporting these dead bodies. So now, when you visit the place today, you see just the ground, and you see some rests of which you can guess what was happening here. For example, you can see a kind of piece of clothes of somebody. You see some kind of blood, yeah, on that, and shoes. One shoe. It means that maybe while they were transporting these dead bodies to bury them in the cemetery, maybe it was fallen out at that moment. And we understand that they are going to make a kind of monument now, because they transported stones. Maybe they will be kind of organizing some official thing for that.
Yeah, so what we know, how these people died. So this is common grave of 100 people. Total there were 420 to 412. These people have died mostly from bullets. This is what Father Andriy told us, and this is also gives us an impression what kind of victims there were. So, of course, as we said, there were shellings. There were many houses destroyed. By the way, when we were talking about, for example, these bridges over the river Irpin. So when you enter this conglomerate from Hostomel to Bucha, there is this bridge which is destroyed, and also a bridge in the town of Irpin. So why is that? Because when Ukrainian forces, I imagine, were approaching, Russians were trying to to shell the bridge. Another thing which is very important, also visited two so-called car cemeteries in Hostomel and in Bucha. We also posted the photos on our Twitter, UkraineWorld Twitter, both from Bucha and Hostomel. So you can see a huge number of cars. Well, they're now being already redislocated. So several dozens of cars in each of places, and I think there were much more. And most probably these are cars of civilians who tried to evacuate and who were just shot, shelled, and there were, you can see, for example, inside there were women, there were kids, there are some of the remains of their belongings. Many of them are burnt, so they're totally burnt. It seems that there were huge tank strikes or, shells, and many of them are even smashed, as if by as a can, as if they were just run over by a tank or something like that.
Yeah, and this is extremely heartbreaking to look at these cars, because you can still vividly imagine what was happening, because you see the car, a normal car, when you drive, you have your objects. I don't know, could it be clothes or any kind of cosmetics for women or any kind of toys for kids, and you saw everything in disorder, as if people really, they took the objects they needed for the road, and they took this car, they were trying to escape Bucha or Irpin or Gostomel, and they were shot just on their way. And from what we know, that cars, they stayed, some cars, they stayed for a month, just by the road, and nobody did nothing, was unable, Ukrainians were unable to do whatever, and Russians, they were just leaving these cars, and I mean, dead bodies were staying inside the cars for the whole month, or for several weeks at least. So it is something horrible to see, because you just see this moment of destruction. When you look at these cars today, you just can really imagine this moment of when normal people, as we are, as everybody, just trying to leave the war to save your life or the life of your kids, and you are just killed on your way. And we've also seen at least several cars with this white, not flag, but a white sign. They were attaching a white sign, maybe saying that we are civilians, something like that. We're civilians, and we still don't know the exact reason why really they were shelling at these cars. What was the reason? Because it was quite clear there was no military vehicles. It was just normal cars, and it was quite clear that there were people inside, I mean civilians. What was the reason to kill them on their way? They were of no danger for Russian army. But the problem is that we really see a lot of dozens of these cars in Bucha, but also in Hostomel. There is a different place in Hostomel for that kind of cars, and another place in Bucha, and maybe in Irpin. Irpin, we haven't seen that, but maybe it also exists.
So the stories we heard that there were really torture rooms, because all the world has seen the bodies with people having their hands tied behind their backs. But it seems that there are several such places where there were several bodies with bags on their heads, with their hands tied at their backs, all killed with bullets into the heads. So maybe the Russians were trying, to disclose a kind of a underground movement or get some information or whatever. So they were probably killing one by one, so that to force others to speak, and then kill those who survived, because they didn't want to have witnesses or something like that. Also, we know that, coming back to these cars, we know the stories when there was the whole family in the car, like a woman, a man, 2 kids, 3 kids, and they were just shelled and killed everybody. There are stories when people were really put into the underground and just left to breathe some air for 5 minutes. There were stories when, for example, a person would go out of this underground and then shot dead, just to have a smoke and shot dead. There was this idea, this event, for example, right?
And there were also, when we asked the priest Andrew about the proportion between men and women, he told us that there were bigger part of men, but also there were women and the children. So the question is why. So we asked this question why many times. What was the reason of all these killings? Why they were killing even men? Because they were civilians. It was quite clear that they were not military. And the element of the response was maybe that they were afraid. They were afraid of men. They were thinking they would meet kind of Nazi, fascists or whatever, aggressive or maybe military. And they felt insecure in Bucha, and they were trying to eliminate any kind of danger coming from the locals. it cannot explain the same thing for women and for kids. But some women we do know do have evidences of women raped and even teenagers also in Bucha. Many cases. I'm not sure for numbers, and this is extremely complicated to talk about statistics because not everybody is able and ready to talk about this kind of crime. But yes, really, they were afraid of people, of locals. They were afraid of. That's why they were killing. That's why they were torturing them, because they were trying to find a kind of complotism or anything against the Russian army.
And they were also searching mobile phones, so they were really afraid that people who were staying here were, spying on them and sending the coordinates to the Ukrainian artillery, etc. Which was maybe sometimes it was the case, but I think most probably most often it was not the case, right? What else? We were told the story that some people were killed from this. How to say it? The big calibers, and that means that if it enters your head is just blown up. And we listen to the stories like a person was driving a bicycle or a motorbike and then killed, and then this body like this by a sniper, and then this body was for several weeks lying on the road. So this is it. This is the story of Bucha. Of course, there are many more, but that's what we heard. That's what's we have seen. That's what we can share.
Maybe the last one important thing to tell. So, around from 3 to 5,000 people left. Were in Bucha during the occupation, and other people they left before. And at that very moment, it is extremely difficult to get any kind of testimonies because people who lived in Bucha through the occupation, at least what we were said, most of them they left Bucha just for how to say it, for rehabilitation procedure, something like that, just left for several times. But on the contrary, people who left Bucha in the beginning of the war, now they're progressively coming back. It looks deserted at that very moment. Bucha, we were witnesses of the first supermarket open in Bucha. 2 days ago, the first not that big supermarket. Before that, you could buy some food in this kind of small shop, so in open air markets or exchanging things. There were periods when there were no electricity in Bucha during the occupation.
But still, some
Still some
districts, for example, we went to this most tragic place between the street Vokzalna and the street Yablunska, and there are still the electricity networks. They're still cut, so there is no electricity there. Many houses are destroyed. Those pictures that you have seen, most probably they are coming from these two streets. So in some districts there are electricity, water, heating, everything's fine. In some others there are still no electricity, for example. So it's gradually coming back to life. Of course, there are some apocalyptic images when you enter Bucha on this just crossroad, the bridge between Hostomel and then Irpin and Bucha. I think every house is destroyed, and so our typical way to Bucha, for example, because Bucha and Irpin were also recreation sites, right? People were going from Kyiv to have a spa in Grand Admiral in Kyiv, for example. Unfortunately, it is now destroyed as well. So you still have these billboards, have a good spa there, or go to the dancing there. And all these billboards are on this background of destroyed houses. This is also one of the...
Yeah, but the overall, when you are already in Bucha, the overall impression is that, and we are now in spring, so a lot of flowers, a lot of trees, and it looks like optimistic because the sky is blue.
Carefully optimistic because the town will be soon coming back to life. Maybe We cannot say about this Hostomel or Irpin. In Hostomel, when we just left the car near this car cemetery, I was so shocked by the silence, but the incredible silence, because there is no people around, no cars which are passing by. So
And I imagine that a lot of families whose houses are not destroyed, they will maybe think twice before coming back, because when you pronounce now Bucha, it looks like a horrible place, Bucha massacre, and maybe some people will never come back, even if their houses are more or less all right. But just imagine they will be present there, and they will be imagining, I don't know, dead bodies in streets or something like that. So we are not sure about that. We know that life is much stronger than the death, and the people normally will come back. But let's see how it goes in the following months. It's still quite difficult to say if it will. We could imagine this to be a normal place to live.
yes, exactly. I think you see that Bucha or Irpin Hostomel are really a big wound, and we don't know whether it will be. Well, obviously, life will not be as it were before, so people will be in these memories for very long time.
And they plan, as I've heard, they plan to leave the bridge, Irpin bridge, as it is now, to make a kind of bridge which exists already, just close to this destroyed apocalyptic image, and then to make kind of, and then maybe put it under the glass or something like that, just for everybody to remember what was happening here, I don't know, months or years ago. I think it's a good idea.
Maybe the same with epicenter in Bucha. There is this building supermarket, building mall epicenter, and it's totally destroyed. So just totally destroyed. So maybe do something with that, not just rebuilding it, but of course it's a private
It's
property.
impossible.
So
I think for epicenter, it is just impossible to rebuild. You have to destruct it and then to build something else. Or you can have a choice to leave it as it is and to make a kind of museum of Russian aggression or something. That is, I don't know, maybe it could be a good idea for this memory, I know, for collective memory of how Russian army behaved here in Ukraine and in Bucha specifically.
yeah, so let's talk about some news. What's happening on the front line? The front line is, of course, not around Kyiv anymore. It's in the east, and it seems that Russians are trying to approach, to attack, but very slowly. So their progress is very slowly. And what we hear from the military experts is that we can really expect Ukrainian counteroffensive soon, because one of the big news of the past week is that Americans are approving the Lend-Lease to Ukraine.
Yeah, so it's a kind of decisive moment now. We are not military experts, but what military experts say, that Russians are already suffering from this lack of energy to attack, specifically in Izium of Kharkiv region. They were trying to make this real offensive in order to surrender this important Ukrainian Ukrainian army on the front line in Donbass. This is strategic thing, and they are failing. At that very moment, they even sent Gerasimov. Gerasimov is the leader, how you say it?
The chief of staff. Right?
Chief of staff, yeah. Chief of staff there. And he came, it's not confirmed officially, but there are rumors that he could be present personally in Izium, just to be present and to maybe to motivate Russian troops to attack. But for at least 2, 3, or maybe even 4 days, they are unable to progress in any kind. So no progress of any kind. So, and they are trying. It looks like that they will be weakening their attacks in the coming days. And this is a question of days, or maybe 1 week, maybe 10 days, and their attack will be over. They will be incapable to continue their offensive. And that will be a decisive moment for Ukrainian army, because at that moment we are receiving a lot of weapons coming from the West, not from Lend-Lease directly, but already weapons who were arranged before. And it will be a moment, as experts say, in the end of the May, Ukrainian army will be able to counterattack really in all directions, and this counterattack will be decisive for this war.
Yeah, and I think there is a big change compared to 2014, because in 2014, well, Russians annexed Crimea, but many people in Crimea were maybe supportive of this. Let's be honest. Of course, not in these figures of the referendum, but if a real referendum would be held in Crimea, I still think that there will be much more. Majority will vote for staying within Ukraine under normal circumstances, if there is a real fair process, discussion, etc. But the number of people who would want to separate from Ukraine would be maybe 30-40% or something. The same also with Donbass, Donetsk, and Luhansk. There were much lesser presence of this. They were much less stronger, these pro-Russian forces. But when we are now talking about Ukrainian Donbass, Ukrainian government controlled, or especially the south, the Kherson Oblast,
which was never
absolutely not pro-Russian at all, and we have seen it from, when Kherson people under Ukrainian flags, they were going against the Russians, etc. Obviously, there was some discussion after 2014 whether Crimea or Donetsk and Luhansk, whether they are truly Ukrainian. There cannot be any such kind of discussion now about Kherson or about Mariupol or about the south. That means that Ukrainians' drive to liberate these territories is much stronger, and that means also that Ukrainians, if and when they liberate these territories newly occupied, they will not stop on this.
They will not stop on the frontier with Crimea or with Donetsk and Lugansk. The big question, military question, is how to liberate cities. I mean, Donetsk and Lugansk and Kherson, because in this counterattack, from the military point of view, it is much more difficult to liberate cities because it means street fights or whatever. And I think this is a big question the Ukrainian army is already thinking about, how to do that technically, because without destroying, we cannot destroy, like Russians. The Russians, they destroyed Mariupol to take it. Ukrainian army cannot destroy Kherson to liberate it, because it would not be liberation. It will be destruction. So they should find a way to liberate it without destroying it. So it is extremely complicated. And this is an extremely big problem for Ukraine, that Kherson as a city is occupied. Because when you liberate villages, I don't know, these huge spaces and with small villages, it's much more easy. When it comes to big cities like Kherson, it's 500,000 of people living there. It's a huge city on 2 rivers and with big bridge. So it's like Kyiv, it's impossible to take such a big city without massive destruction. So, but let Ukrainian army do what it's able to do. But important is to say that Ukraine, today we can talk about this decisiveness of Ukrainian army, of Ukrainian state, and of Ukrainian people to continue the war up to victory. So we are not afraid now to pronounce the word victory, and the victory would mean for us, for Ukrainians, the liberation of the whole Ukrainian territory in the state before 2014. So it means Donbass and Lugansk and Crimea. Crimea, even if it would be more difficult.
Yes, but again, this drive is present, and Ukraine is really supported right now militarily by the whole free world, but by the whole democratic world. It's Lend-Lease, but it also means that American defense sector can be reloading its capacity and produce more arms. it sounds crazy, of course, for all the pacifists in the world, but unfortunately, this is the truth. And this is what Ukrainians, human rights activists, are now doing. They ask the West for more arms, human rights activists, because we understand that if there is no military victory right now, it will all come back with any kind of form. It will all come back again. So Russians will. It's very interesting what that they will do on their victory day. It will be already in a week, on 9th of May.
We'll make a special podcast about
Yeah,
that.
I
About the
think we
day.
should make a special podcast about this. What is called Победобесие, this craziness of this victory myth. And it is also important what Putin will tell to the nation, to the Russian nation, to the Russians, because of course, he can present taking Mariupol as his victory, and he can say that all this piece of land near the Black Sea, it's already a Novorossiya, of which he dreamt of. But the question is whether he will declare general mobilization. And we are coming now to the last part. We see what's going on in Russian propaganda. We already touched upon it briefly in this topic in one of our previous episodes, saying that Russians are increasingly, presenting this war as a defensive war, as if it's not that they attacked, as if they are defending themselves against NATO, against America, etc. Now, one of the narratives is that they try to prevent the Third World War. So it's not that they are starting the Third World War. Earlier they were saying, look, the Third World War is already going on. It was openly said by Russian propagandists that this is a World War III, etc. Now they are saying, no, we're trying to prevent it. And they are saying that the West is intimidating Russia, quote, a standard method of intimidation and a fairly popular topic for Western speculation, end of quote, that they're basically trying to intimidate Russia with a World War III, and Ukraine is trying to prevent it. So RIA Novosti, Russia's major propaganda outlet, published an article saying that, quote, Western society is being prepared for the Third World War, end of quote, and quote, Western inhabitants are being forced to conclude that a world war is now not only inevitable, but that is already underway, end of quote. Again, as we say, Russians are, they are mirroring what they hear from Ukrainian side and from the Western side. They're just the mirror. It's an ideal but distorted mirror reflection of that. So Ukrainians are saying that our heroical defense is basically preventing from the Third World War because we're trying not to let Russia, advance. But that's what the Russians say, and they speculate very much on this idea that Poles will occupy Western Ukraine, part of the central Ukraine. So, quote, the idea of the Polish government to introduce a NATO peacekeeping contingent into Ukraine, which is again guaranteed to lead to the start of the global conflict, end of quote. And, so this is what's going on. And even Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesperson, said recently that, quote, the prevention of World War III is a goal of the operation in Ukraine. He said this on Sky News. So, yeah, this is our logic. This is their logic,
So you have some problems to understand their logic, but what we see now, and surely enough, nuclear risks are still there, but what we see from the Western reaction during the last weeks, they are no more really afraid of that threats, nuclear threats. And Russian propaganda is delivering sometimes different narratives and different messages for different audiences. So we'll still have a close look on what they are saying, just to try to understand what they will do.
Yes, so stay with us and listen to our podcast. We will regularly update you on this. Was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld.org. This series about the war is a common initiative from Internews Ukraine and Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Tetyana Ogarkova and Volodymyr Yermolenko are with you. Follow us on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, SoundCloud. You can also support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.